The airport buzzed with life. Passengers hurried past departure gates. Flight attendants maneuvered through crowds, and the distant hum of intercom announcements filled the air. The Horizon Airlines Pilot's Lounge stood tucked away from the chaos, a sanctuary reserved for the airline's finest. Inside, Elijah Jackson, a 16-year-old aviation enthusiast, sat comfortably in a leather chair, his eyes fixed on the large flat-screen TV mounted on the wall. A documentary on the evolution of commercial aviation played, detailing the precision of jet engines and the brilliance of modern aircraft. Elijah wasn't just a casual observer. He was mesmerized. Every number, every statistic, every mechanical detail about airplanes fascinated him. While kids his age were obsessed with gaming or social media, Elijah dreamt of becoming a commercial airline pilot. His bedroom walls weren't covered with music posters, but aviation charts and cockpit layouts. He adjusted the official visitor badge hanging from his lanyard, a badge that he had earned through Horizon Airlines' prestigious Career Shadow program. It was his golden ticket, his first real step toward his dream. As he leaned forward, engrossed in the documentary, the lounge door swung open. Captain Rebecca Whitman, a senior Horizon Airlines pilot, walked in with the air of someone who commanded respect. Dressed in a flawless navy blue uniform, her 4 gold stripes gleamed on her sleeves. She carried herself like a veteran of the skies, exuding confidence, but with a sharp edge of arrogance. She was in her mid-40s, blonde, with a face hardened by years of authority, and the moment her icy blue eyes landed on Elijah, they narrowed with suspicion. A black teenager, alone in her lounge. She stopped in her tracks, her grip tightening around the tablet she carried. Her gaze dropped to the visitor badge around Elijah's neck. Something about him sitting there so at ease irritated her. She took a step closer. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was sharp, cutting through the soft hum of the television. Elijah looked up, startled. He wasn't expecting anyone to address him so abruptly. I'm just waiting here," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Miss Reynolds told me to stay in the lounge until she gets back. I'm part of the Career Shadow program." Whitman's brows knitted together. "I don't think so." She crossed her arms, looking him up and down. "This area is for pilots and authorized personnel only. You need to leave." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. "But I have clearance," he said, holding up his badge. "I won the program's competition." "Miss Reynolds," Whitman snatched the badge off his lanyard before he could finish. Elijah's stomach dropped. She held the badge up, examining it like it was a counterfeit bill. She twisted her lips into a frown. "This can't be real," she muttered. "No way they gave this level of access to someone like you." The words stung. Someone like you. Elijah's hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had done nothing wrong. "It's real," he said firmly. "Please, just call Miss Reynolds. She'll explain everything." Whitman let out a sharp breath, then glanced around the lounge as if expecting backup. The room was mostly empty, save for a few flight crew members who glanced over but quickly looked away. Whitman's eyes darkened with irritation. "I don't have time for this." She reached for her radio. "Security, I need immediate assistance in the pilot's lounge. There's an unauthorized individual here." Elijah's heart pounded. Unauthorized individual. She made it sound like he was a criminal. "Wait, what?" Elijah stammered. "I'm literally just watching TV. I haven't done anything." Whitman didn't care. She was already speaking into her radio. "Young black male, no ID, possibly a security threat. Send officers now." Elijah's stomach twisted. A security threat? He glanced around, hoping for help. No one spoke up. The few crew members in the lounge pretended not to hear anything. Then, the sound of footsteps approaching. 2 uniformed airport security officers entered. Their eyes locked into Elijah immediately. They didn't question anything. They just saw a black kid and assumed the worst. Elijah's chest tightened. You got ID?" one of them barked. I did, but she took it." Elijah gestured to Whitman, who folded her arms smugly. "It was fake," she said dismissively. One of the officers moved forward, resting a hand on his belt, right where his handcuffs were. From across the lounge, a pair of sharp eyes observed the scene. Jason Statham had been standing near the coffee machine, watching everything unfold. He had seen Whitman's behavior, the way she dismissed the boy's words, the way security immediately escalated the situation without asking questions, and he didn't like it. Jason was dressed casually, in a black leather jacket and dark jeans, but there was an unmistakable presence about him, the kind that made people uneasy. His jaw tightened as he watched Elijah try to reason with security. He had seen this scenario play out too many times before. A kid, unfairly targeted, a racist authority figure twisting the truth. Security acting first, thinking later. Jason's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was abuse of power. And if there was one thing Jason Statham couldn't stand, it was bullies. He stepped forward. Time to intervene. The tension in the pilot's lounge had thickened like a storm about to break. The moment Captain Rebecca Whitman had radioed for security, the situation had already spiraled beyond reason. Within seconds, 2 airport security officers stormed in. Officer Mitchell, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a hardened expression, led the way, followed closely by his younger partner, Officer Daniels. Their eyes immediately locked onto Elijah, their postures stiff with authority. They didn't question anything. They already assumed he was guilty. Elijah's breath hitched as both officers strode toward him. "What's going on here?" Officer Mitchell demanded, his voice laced with irritation. Whitman crossed her arms, her smug expression unwavering. "This kid is trespassing in a restricted area. He's got a fake badge." Elijah snapped his head toward her. "What? That's not true." He reached for his lanyard, but the badge was gone, still in Whitman's grip. "My badge is real. I'm part of the Horizon Airlines Career Shadow Program. Call Miss Reynolds. She'll confirm it." Officer Mitchell held out a hand, cutting him off. "All right, kid. Hands where we can see them." Elijah froze. The words sent a chill down his spine. His gaze darted around the room, searching for help. The few pilots and crew members present avoided eye contact, pretending they weren't witnessing what was unfolding. Whitman took a step closer to the officers, her voice oozing authority. "He refuses to leave. I gave him multiple warnings." Elijah gritted his teeth. Warnings? She hadn't even given him a chance to explain. He forced himself to stay calm, but his heart pounded wildly against his ribs. "Sir, please, just check with Miss Reynolds," he urged. "She told me to wait here. I'm not trespassing." Officer Daniels, the younger of the two, hesitated slightly. "Who's Miss Reynolds?" "She's with HR," Elijah said quickly. "She's the one who approved me for this program." For a brief second, there was a flicker of doubt on Daniel's face, but before he could react, Whitman scoffed. She held up the visitor badge, inspecting it like it was a counterfeit bill. "There's no way Horizon Airlines would give this level of clearance to someone like you." There it was again. That subtle, venomous someone like you. Elijah's fist clenched. Officer Mitchell's patience ran out. "Look, either you show us real ID or we have to take you out of here. Your choice." Elijah snapped. "I already did." His raised voice echoed through the lounge. Several heads turned toward the commotion, whispers starting to spread. Whitman's jaw tightened at his outburst. "You're getting aggressive now?" she sneered. "That's exactly why security needs to handle this." Elijah felt a deep, helpless rage boiling inside him. He had seen stories like this before. Young black men accused of being aggressive when all they did was defend themselves. And now it was happening to him. Across the room, Jason Statham stood completely still. To an outsider, it might have seemed like he wasn't interested in the situation at all, but Jason was watching everything. He had spent years in special forces, trained to observe every detail before making a move. And right now, every instinct in his body told him that this was more than a simple misunderstanding. He had seen how quickly power could be abused. He saw the way Whitman's lips curled with satisfaction every time she dismissed Elijah. He saw how Officer Mitchell never even considered checking the badge before jumping to conclusions. He saw how Elijah's words were falling on deaf ears. Jason had dealt with bullies before, and he had zero tolerance for them. But he also knew timing was everything. He wasn't about to step in too soon. Not yet. Not until it mattered most. Elijah gritted his teeth. He wasn't going to just stand there and let them treat him like this. With a shaking hand, he pulled out his phone and dialed Miss Reynolds' number. The phone rang once, twice. Then, voicemail. His stomach sank. Officer Mitchell narrowed his eyes. "Who are you calling?" "Miss Reynolds," Elijah answered quickly. "She'll confirm everything." Mitchell lunged forward, grabbing Elijah's wrist. "Oh, no you don't." Elijah jerked back, eyes widening. Whitman smirked. "See? He's resisting." Officer Mitchell grabbed Elijah's shoulder and shoved him against the wall. The breath rushed out of Elijah's lungs. The wall felt cold against his back. His chest rose and fell rapidly. He struggled to breathe through the panic creeping in. He saw Officer Daniels hesitate again, looking between Elijah and his partner. Jason saw it too. That was his cue. Jason Statham. Steps in, Jason moved. Silent, calculated, precise. In the blink of an eye, he was right behind them. "That's enough." The words were calm, controlled, but the weight behind them was undeniable. Everyone in the room froze. Officer Mitchell turned, still gripping Elijah's wrist. His expression darkened when he saw Jason. Jason held his ground, eyes cold as steel. "Let him go." For a moment there was silence. Then Mitchell scoffed. "And who the hell are you?" Jason took a step closer. Not threatening, but not backing down either. "Someone who doesn't like what he's seeing." Whitman's face twisted in annoyance. "Stay out of this. This doesn't concern you." Jason's eyes flicked to Elijah, pinned against the wall, breathing heavy. Then back to Mitchell, still gripping the kid like a criminal. Jason's voice dropped lower. "It does now." The weight of his words settled over the room. A few pilots shifted uncomfortably, sensing the shift in energy. For the first time, Whitman looked uneasy. Jason's presence alone had changed the entire dynamic. He wasn't just some random bystander. He was someone who knew how to handle situations like this. And now, he was about to turn the tables. The air in the pilot's lounge had shifted. Where moments ago Captain Rebecca Whitman held full control of the situation, she now found herself facing something she hadn't expected: resistance. And not just from Elijah, from Jason Statham. The room was still as Jason locked eyes with Officer Mitchell, his presence alone radiating an unspoken authority. "Let him go." Mitchell hesitated. It was clear he wasn't used to being challenged. But there was something about the way Jason spoke, something that made him question whether he really wanted to push this further. His grip on Elijah's wrist loosened slightly. Jason took the opportunity to step closer, now standing between Elijah and the security officers. His calm, calculated gaze moved between them, then settled on Whitman. "Let's start over," he said, his voice steady but edged with steel. "Did anyone here even bother to check his credentials?" Silence. Officer Daniels shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the badge still clenched in Whitman's hand. Mitchell's jaw tightened. "The captain said it's fake." Jason's brow lifted. "Oh, and you just took her word for it?" Mitchell squared his shoulders. "She's a senior pilot. She wouldn't lie." Jason's lips curled into a smirk, but there was no amusement in it. "That's funny, because from where I'm standing, it looks like she's lying right now." Whitman's face flushed red with anger. "Excuse me?" Jason ignored her. His attention remained on Elijah. He crouched slightly, keeping his voice low but firm. "Kid, you said you're part of the Horizon Airlines Career Shadow Program?" Elijah nodded quickly. "Yes. Miss Reynolds from HR approved me. She gave me that badge." Jason looked at Whitman again. "That's the badge you snatched out of his hands, yeah?" Whitman's fingers tightened around the plastic ID. "This doesn't concern you." Jason's expression darkened. "See, that's where you're wrong." His voice was quieter now, more dangerous. Whitman scoffed, but there was an edge of nervousness creeping in. This lounge is for pilots and authorized personnel, she shot back. People like him don't belong here. Jason's eyes flashed with something dangerous. People like him. He had heard that phrase too many times before, in different places, under different circumstances. He had seen what came next. He straightened, stepping closer to Whitman. Say that again. Whitman's confidence faltered. She had expected security to remove Elijah without question, not to be questioned herself. She scoffed, flipping the badge between her fingers. All I know is that this isn't standard clearance. If it's real, he should have proper authorization on record. Jason chuckled under his breath. She was scrambling. Jason turned back to Elijah, his voice quieter now. Listen, kid, you know where the security cameras are in here? Elijah blinked, momentarily thrown off by the question. Then, his eyes lit up. Yeah, he said quickly. There's one right there. He discreetly tilted his chin toward the upper corner of the lounge, where a small security camera was mounted near the ceiling. Jason followed his gaze and nodded approvingly. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. His fingers moved swiftly, dialing a number. Officer Mitchell narrowed his eyes. Who the hell are you calling? Jason didn't answer. He turned slightly away, his voice low as he spoke into the phone. Yeah, it's me. I need a favor. On the other end, a deep voice responded immediately. What kind of favor? Jason glanced at Whitman, who was now watching him with suspicion. Pilot's Lounge, Terminal C. I need access to the last 30 minutes of surveillance footage, now. The voice hesitated for half a second before responding. Give me 5 minutes. Jason hung up and slid his phone back into his jacket pocket. Whitman folded her arms, trying to regain control. I don't know what you think you're doing, but... Jason held up a hand, silencing her. You've talked enough. The next few minutes passed in tense silence. Elijah shifted uneasily, watching Jason with a mix of confusion and hope. The security officers, now less confident than before, exchanged uncertain glances. Whitman, however, remained rigid, her jaw clenched as she tried to mask her growing unease. Then, Jason's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, swiped across the screen, and smirked. There it is! The tension snapped as he turned the screen toward the officers. On the video feed, the footage played out clearly. Elijah walking into the lounge with his badge already around his neck. Miss Reynolds escorting him inside. Elijah sitting down quietly, watching TV, never causing any trouble. Jason zoomed in on the timestamp. That's 25 minutes ago. His eyes flicked toward Mitchell. Looks like the kid's telling the truth. Mitchell leaned in, watching the screen, his lips pressed into a thin line. Daniels, the younger officer, glanced at Whitman. Captain. Whitman said nothing. Her hands curled into fists. Jason wasn't done. He swiped to another angle, showing Whitman snatching Elijah's badge. Then, her radioing security and lying about him being unauthorized. Jason let the footage play in full silence. Then he locked eyes with Whitman. So, you want to explain why you lied? The entire room felt different now. Security wasn't looking at Elijah anymore. They were looking at her. Whitman's face burned with humiliation. She gritted her teeth, scrambling for an excuse. That doesn't change the fact that... Jason cut her off. It changes everything. He turned to Mitchell and Daniels. You were about to cuff a kid because she said so. No questions, no proof. Just her word. Mitchell stiffened, shifting uncomfortably. Daniels cleared his throat, avoiding eye contact. Jason took a step forward, his voice dropping. You're going to want to think real carefully about your next move. The weight of his words hung in the air. Mitchell exhaled sharply. Then slowly he unclipped his radio. Dispatch, stand down on Terminal C. No further action needed. Jason grinned. Whitman's eyes widened in horror. The tables had officially turned, and Jason Statham was just getting started. Captain Rebecca Whitman could feel the ground crumbling beneath her. The security footage had destroyed her fabricated story. Elijah had entered the lounge legally. His badge was real, and he had done nothing wrong. Yet here she was, standing in the middle of the lounge, having publicly accused an innocent black teenager of trespassing. She should have stopped. She should have admitted her mistake. But instead, panic twisted into desperation. Whitman's face flushed red, her grip tightening around her radio. "HQ, this is Captain Whitman at Terminal C," she said, forcing authority back into her voice. "I need immediate backup. We have an escalating security situation, an unauthorized individual and a civilian interfering with airport security." Jason raised a brow, amused. Civilian interfering? That's what she was calling him now? Mitchell and Daniels exchanged uncertain glances. Daniels, the younger of the two, took a cautious step forward. Captain, we just saw the footage. The kid is causing a disturbance," Whitman cut in sharply. "And this man," she pointed at Jason, "is obstructing security protocol." Jason's smirk widened. She was digging her grave deeper. The radio crackled to life. "Copy that, Captain. Dispatching additional units now." Whitman's eyes gleamed with false triumph. Oh, within minutes, 3 more security officers arrived, their hands resting near their belts. Unlike Mitchell and Daniels, they hadn't seen the footage. They only knew one thing, that a senior airline captain had called them for backup. And that meant taking control by any means necessary. The tallest officer, Sergeant Brooks, stepped forward. His eyes locked onto Jason, scanning him with practiced suspicion. "Sir, I need you to step aside. Right now." Jason didn't move. "You sure about that?" His voice was calm, but the weight behind it was undeniable. Brooks took a step closer, his stance firm. "Captain Whitman reported you as a civilian interfering with an ongoing security matter." Jason let out a low chuckle. "That right?" He turned slightly, looking at Whitman with an unreadable expression. Whitman refused to meet his gaze. Jason knew exactly what was happening. He had seen it before. She was using the system to cover her tracks. She had failed to get Elijah removed quietly, so now she was escalating the situation, shifting the focus onto Jason, making him the threat. And these new officers didn't know any better. Jason sighed, his gaze calculating. "You're making a mistake," he said, directing it at the new officers. "Maybe you should ask these two." He motioned toward Mitchell and Daniels. "What really happened before you embarrass yourselves?" Sergeant Brooks wasn't interested. "I said, step aside." Jason's jaw tightened, but he still didn't move. Elijah had been silent for the past minute, his mind spinning. His whole life, he had been taught that when authority speaks, you listen, that when security says stop, you stop, that fighting back only makes things worse. But right now, Jason wasn't backing down. And for the first time, Elijah didn't want to either. He straightened his shoulders. "If you're gonna arrest me," he said, his voice louder than before, "you better have proof." The words rippled through the room like a shockwave. Mitchell and Daniels stiffened. They knew Elijah was innocent. One of the new officers, Officer Ramirez, hesitated. His grip on his belt relaxed slightly. Whitman's eyes flickered with annoyance. "This is ridiculous." She spun toward Elijah. "You had no right to be in this lounge." "I did," Elijah cut her off. His voice was strong now, steady, unshaken. "I earned that badge. I wrote the essay. I won the competition. I was invited here. You just didn't want to believe that a black kid belonged in your precious lounge." Whitman flinched. A murmur spread through the few onlookers, pilots and crew members who had been pretending not to see what was happening. Now, they were watching closely. Jason grinned. "You got guts, kid." Jason knew talking wasn't going to fix this. If Security HQ was already involved, they needed someone higher up to intervene. Someone with real authority. Jason pulled out his phone. One more call. He stepped away from the officers, voice calm and deliberate. "Yeah, it's me. I've got a situation at Terminal C. Need you here. Now." On the other end, a strong female voice responded. "Understood. Give me 5 minutes." Jason ended the call and looked back at the officers. Sergeant Brooks was losing patience. "Sir, if you don't comply, we'll have to detain you." Jason tilted his head, unfazed. I suggest you think very carefully about your next move. His words hung in the air. This wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Brooks hesitated. He had seen men like Jason before, men who didn't bluff. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, the sound of heels clicking against the floor. Someone was approaching. Fast, Jason smirked. Right on time. The sharp click-clack of heels against the polished airport floor cut through the tense silence. The security officers shifted uneasily, and even Captain Rebecca Whitman stiffened. Someone important was approaching. Jason didn't turn around immediately. Instead, he watched as the color drained from Whitman's face. She recognized who was coming, and that meant Jason's backup had arrived. A commanding voice broke through the tension. "What the hell is going on here?" Tanya Reynolds, senior HR executive for Horizon Airlines, stormed into the lounge. She was a black woman in her early 50s, dressed in a perfectly tailored blazer and slacks, her posture radiating authority. Her sharp brown eyes scanned the room, taking in the security officers, the anxious onlookers. Jason standing calmly, and finally Elijah, his fist clenched, his breathing heavy. Her expression darkened. "Elijah," she asked, her voice softer now. Elijah exhaled sharply, his face filled with relief. "Miss Reynolds!" Tanya turned to the security team, her voice hard as steel. "Someone better start talking, right now." Jason finally moved, reaching into his jacket and pulling out his phone. "That's exactly what I was waiting for," he said, his voice smooth. "Take a look at this." He walked toward Tanya and handed her his phone. On the screen, the security footage played. Elijah entering the lounge with his visitor badge. Miss Reynolds herself escorting him inside. Elijah sitting quietly, watching TV. Whitman approaching him, snatching his badge. Her lying into the radio, calling security. Tanya's jaw tightened. Her grip on the phone tightened. She turned slowly toward Whitman. "Is this some kind of joke?" Tanya's voice was dangerously low. "You called security on a student I personally approved for this program?" Whitman lifted her chin, her arrogance flickering beneath her cracking facade. "I was following security protocol." Tanya took a slow step forward. "Security protocol?" she repeated. "Security protocol is verifying facts before accusing someone of trespassing. Security protocol is not humiliating a student, lying on the radio, and nearly getting a kid arrested." Whitman's nostrils flared. She was losing ground, and she knew it. But she still refused to back down. "Look, I don't care what your footage says," Whitman snapped. "People lie all the time. Maybe he forged that badge. Maybe—" Jason laughed, a low, cold chuckle. Whitman's eyes flicked toward him, irritated. "Something funny?" she spat. Jason tilted his head, his smirk dangerous. "You're sinking, Captain, and instead of swimming, you're grabbing bricks." Whitman's face turned red. Jason glanced at Tanya. "She's not going to admit it, but that's okay, because I don't need her to." Tanya frowned. "What are you—" Jason held up his phone, smirk widening, and pressed one button. "Send." Whitman's stomach dropped. Jason turned his phone around, showing the screen. The security footage was now live on social media. Within seconds, phones buzzed all around the airport. Passengers waiting at gates, airline staff, even pilots, all glanced at their screens. A murmur spread through the lounge as people began whispering. "Did you see this? Some pilot tried to get a black kid arrested for nothing? Wait, that's happening right here?" A group of flight attendants near the coffee station gasped, looking toward Whitman. One of them mouthed, "Oh my God." Security officers shifted uncomfortably. Even Mitchell and Daniels, the original officers, looked at each other uneasily. Whitman's breathing grew rapid. She could feel the walls closing in. Whitman realizes she's losing control. Whitman spun toward Tanya, grasping for anything to regain power. "This is ridiculous. He had no right to—" Tanya held up a hand, a warning. Whitman froze. Tanya's voice was low, calm, and deadly. "You did this to yourself." Whitman swallowed hard. She turned to Jason. You, you think you're some kind of hero? She hissed. Jason's smirk didn't fade. No, he shrugged. I just don't like bullies. Whitman was finished. But Jason, he wasn't done yet. The next blow was coming. And this time she wouldn't recover. The tension in the pilot's lounge had reached its peak. Whitman stood frozen, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her mind racing for a way out. But there wasn't one. Not anymore. Her humiliation was now public, her lies exposed for everyone to see. The murmur of airline staff, passengers, and security officers spread like wildfire. And then, the final nail in the coffin arrived. A new set of footsteps echoed through the terminal, heavy and full of authority. The crowd parted instinctively as Alan Foster, the airport director, strode into the lounge. A tall, no-nonsense man in his 50s. Foster had the kind of presence that commanded immediate respect. His sharp hazel eyes swept across the room, scanning everything, the officers, the gathering crowd, the security footage still playing on people's phones. And then they landed on Whitman. She straightened her posture, grasping for control. Director Foster, I can explain. Foster lifted a hand, silencing her. Save it. His voice was low and firm. He turned to Tanya Reynolds first. What's going on here? Tanya didn't hesitate. She took a step forward, her expression still hardened with anger. This woman, Tanya said, nodding toward Whitman, racially profiled one of our career shadow students, Elijah Jackson. She accused him of trespassing, took his badge, called security under false claims, and nearly got him arrested. Foster's jaw clenched. He turned to Jason. Is this true? Jason smirked. You don't have to take our word for it. He held up his phone and pressed play. Once again, the security footage played, from Elijah walking in with full clearance to Whitman snatching his badge and lying over the radio. Foster's face darkened with rage. He looked at the officers. Is this the footage you saw? Mitchell and Daniels nodded stiffly. Sergeant Brooks, who had arrived later, shifted uncomfortably. Now he understood. Whitman had played them. A heavy silence followed. Then, Foster took a slow, calculated step toward Whitman. Captain Whitman, he said, his voice eerily calm, do you have anything to say for yourself? Whitman swallowed hard, glancing around. But there was no one left to back her up. Mitchell and Daniels had stepped away from her. Sergeant Brooks crossed his arms, no longer seeing her as the victim. Even the flight crew members, pilots who had once worked alongside her, looked at her with disgust. She had lost everything. But her pride wouldn't let her surrender. I was only following protocol, she said, voice shaking. I thought... Foster's eyes narrowed. You thought what? That a black teenager couldn't possibly belong here? Whitman opened her mouth, but no words came out. The weight of her actions had finally crashed down on her. And now, it was time for consequences. Foster turned toward Tanya. Effective immediately, Captain Rebecca Whitman is suspended from duty pending a full investigation. Whitman's face drained of all color. What? She gasped. Foster didn't blink. Turn in your ID and security credentials, now! Whitman shook her head, refusing to accept reality. You can't do this. I've given 20 years to this airline. Foster's voice hardened. Then you should have known better. Whitman looked around desperately, searching for someone, anyone, to defend her. But no one did. Jason watched as two security officers stepped forward, holding out a hand. Whitman, shaking, slowly unclipped her ID badge from her uniform and handed it over. It was over. As Whitman turned to leave, defeated, Jason took one slow step closer to her. She barely glanced at him. She couldn't. Jason leaned in slightly, just enough so only she could hear him. Next time, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Be careful who you mess with. Whitman flinched. And with that, she turned and walked out of the lounge, her career, her reputation, and her power shattered. Elijah watched her go, his heart still hammering. Just minutes ago, he had been terrified. But now he felt something different. He felt powerful. Jason turned to him, studying his expression. "You good, kid?" Elijah took a deep breath, standing up straight. For the first time since this all began, he wasn't afraid. He nodded. "Yeah, I'm good." Jason's smirk returned. He liked this kid. And right now, he knew that Elijah's future had just changed forever. The events of the pilot's lounge scandal spread faster than wildfire. Within hours, the security footage Jason leaked had been shared millions of times across social media. Major news outlets picked up the story, headlines blazing across screens. Racist pilot calls cops on black teen. Exposed by security footage. Horizon Airlines under fire for racial discrimination. Teenage aviation student harassed. Hollywood action star steps in. Airports, airline companies, and even government officials were forced to respond. The public demanded accountability. For Elijah Jackson, his entire world had changed overnight. People rallied behind him. Thousands of messages poured in online. This young man handled the situation with courage. He deserves everything good coming his way. Elijah Jackson, keep fighting. The sky belongs to you. Horizon Airlines, explain this. How many other black students have been shut out of opportunities like this? Aviation schools, mentorship programs, and black pilot organizations reached out, offering Elijah support, scholarships, and guidance. For the first time, he wasn't just some kid who loved planes. He was a symbol of resilience. And that felt better than any headline. Amidst all the chaos, Jason Statham remained silent. He didn't care for the spotlight. He had done what he came to do, take down a bully and make sure justice was served. As Elijah stood near the terminal, scrolling through the overwhelming support he was getting online, Jason approached him. Elijah looked up, surprised. "Jason, I don't even know what to say." Jason smirked. "You already said it. You stood your ground." He reached into his jacket and handed Elijah a small card. Elijah took it, confused. It wasn't a business card, just a phone number. Jason's expression turned serious. "If you ever need backup again, call me." Elijah's eyes widened. Jason Statham just gave him a direct line? Before he could respond, a woman's voice called out behind them. "Elijah!" Elijah turned just in time to see his mother rushing toward him. Monica Jackson was a strong woman, tough, no nonsense, the kind of mother who raised her son to be respectful but never weak. But right now, she looked like a mother who had nearly lost her child to a system designed to break him. She wrapped Elijah in a tight embrace, her voice shaking. "Baby, are you okay?" Elijah hugged her back. "Yeah, Mom, I'm okay." Monica pulled away, her eyes scanning him for any signs of harm. Then she turned her gaze to Jason. For a moment, she just looked at him. Then she nodded. "Thank you." Jason simply nodded back. No need for long conversations. They understood each other. Monica took Elijah's face in her hands. "Come on, let's go home." Jason watched as mother and son walked away together. Then without another word, he turned and left, blending into the airport crowd, disappearing like a shadow in the wind. Unhati, the action hero, never waits for applause. The office of West Coast Aviation Academy had a perfect view of the runway. Planes took off and landed, their engines roaring in the distance. Elijah sat across from the admissions director, hands clasped together, his posture confident. The director, a black man in his late 40s, leaned back in his chair, studying him. "You've made quite a name for yourself, Elijah." Elijah smiled. "I didn't plan on it." The director chuckled. "I'm sure you didn't. But here's the thing. I read your original application essay. You didn't mention any of this. You talked about your love for aviation, about how, as a kid, you could name aircraft just by the sound of their engines. About your dream of flying." Elijah nodded. "That dream hasn't changed." The director folded his hands together. "Tell me something, Elijah. What did you learn from what happened to you at Horizon Airlines?" Elijah took a deep breath, thinking carefully. Then he answered, I learned that the sky doesn't belong to just one kind of person. The director's expression softened. Go on. Elijah sat up straighter. That lounge? That wasn't just about a room. It was about control, about who gets to belong in spaces of power. But I also learned something else. He smiled. You don't ask for permission to belong. You take your place. You make them see you. The director's eyes gleamed with approval. He slid a folder across the desk. Welcome to West Coast Aviation Academy, Elijah. Let's get you flying. Elijah walked out of the office grinning. As he stepped onto the airfield, he heard the roar of engines overhead. He looked up. A massive commercial airliner soared through the sky, disappearing into the clouds. It was everything he had ever dreamed of. He took a deep breath, his future wide open. This was just the beginning.